Welcome everybody to this webinar organized by the International Karl Polanyi Society. We start in time. I will use the first minutes for a little longer introduction than planned, but starting on time, that allows those who are on time to get some information that you might not have heard if you have not participated in the events before. So for those who have participated, it's somehow a repetition, because, as I said, this webinar is the last one of a series of webinars which are supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, to whom we are very grateful for this support. The webinars are also embedded in broader activities of the International Karl Polanyi Society, and that's especially the visiting professorship by Julia Steinberger, who will come to Vienna next week, next year, being the fourth Vienna Karl Polanyi visiting professor. And due to her research interest, we decided kind of setting up activities beforehand, and one of these activities is a joint special issues on shaping provisioning systems for social-ecological transformation. And the participants of this webinar are also authors of this special issue, which is edited by Richard Berntaler, Colin Schneider, and myself. It is also, this webinar, it's the third webinar in a series on shaping provisioning systems. The first webinar, approximately a month ago, was on linking ecological and social considerations, and how to link social-ecological provisioning. The last one, 2 weeks ago, was on issues of democracy and democratic provision. Both of these webinars are available to assist as videos on the IKPS website. And this webinar will also be made available as a video. That means it will be recorded. Now to our webinar, hoping that this introduction has contributed to. This webinar is on transformation here and now, intervention strategies for social-ecological transformation in diverse provisioning systems. And that means it's a little bit the case study webinar. It's the webinar on concrete proposals how to improve provisioning systems. We'll see that the presentations have a strong focus on food and in part also on care. And we have invited, as I said, 3 speakers that have written 2 articles, as Christina Plank and Corinna Dengler have written or intend to write an article together. The article is on ecofeminist political economy perspectives on social-ecological provisioning. And Julie Froud, with colleagues, is writing on renewing the food system in Wales, social and ecological needs. That's more or less the basis also of their contributions, to which I will come in a second. The plan, the outset of this webinar is to have again 3 inputs by the 3 speakers. Afterwards, a short dialogue on, let's say, the podium and the plenary, and then we open for discussions with the audience. That means, in this case, you can write questions in the chat. You will be instructed on this, but you can do this right from the beginning. We can read it and integrate it if it's the number of participants and questions not too large, it can become a little more interactive. But anyhow, we have the clear intention to end at 8 o'clock Central European time. That means to have a 1 hour and a half, more or less, for this webinar. That's the outset, and very short presentation of the three speakers and their topics. Corinna Dengler, who will start. She is assistant professor at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And she will start talking new approaches to provision and work. And then Christina Plank will continue, co-author of Corinna. She is senior lecturer, or also assistant professor, associate professor. Sorry, I missed this. And with a long expertise on degrowth and social-ecological transformation issues. And she will talk about the more specific aspects of the empirical part of the joint article. And Julie Froud, professor at Manchester University, will, as I already said, present quickly key arguments of her articles on renewing the food system in Wales. This said, I hand over to you, Corinna, for the first presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm really happy to be here, Andreas, and all the colleagues for the kind invitation. Let me just briefly share my presentation with you. So as Andreas has already mentioned, what I want to talk about today is feminist approaches to social provisioning and work, and kind of a conceptual framework, or some remarks at least, about why we need a broader or an eco-feminist understanding of the economy. And in this article, I'm co-writing with Christina. We start from an analysis of recent debates on provisioning systems, where provisioning systems are commonly defined as a set of related elements that work together in the transformation of resources to satisfy a foreseen human need. And what we see here is there is a focus on needs connected to resource use. There is a link between biophysical and social dimension. This definition highlights the role of actors, institutions, and power relations. And it kind of provides a political economy grounding of the debate on resources and needs. I'm just checking. Oh, you see my presentation. That's weird. Okay, let me just very briefly check how to change this.
You can change it at Anzeigereinstellungen, yeah, above, and then you should be able to, no, not Taskleiste, so you see Anzeigereinstellungen next to it, and then you should be able to change the screens.
Damn.
Oh, no.
I guess I might just...
Yeah, here you can also turn it off with the Referentenansicht.
Ah, yeah. Einstellungen. Sorry, I've never did this before. Is it now better?
Yeah, now we can see.
Perfect. Sorry. So exactly. So one thing that we saw in those debates on provisioning system, which have been really flourishing over the last couple of years, is that they don't really relate so much to older debates on social provisionings that we have had in heterodox economics. So in heterodox economics, we had also conceptual groundwork, for example, in institutional economics and political economy, ecological economics, and what Christina and I focus on, feminist economics, where in contrast to neoclassical definitions that regard economics as, you all know, it's a study of the allocation of scarce resources. So social provisioning definition says that economics is really a study of provisioning goods and services to fulfill societal needs. And one especially, so one strand in heterodox economics versus concept of social provisioning has been really elaborated a lot is in feminist economics, as I already mentioned. So there was this paper in 2004 by Marilyn Power called Social Provisioning as a Starting Point for Feminist Economics. And it was really a key contribution for the heterodox economic field of feminist economics. So for example, there is this newer handbook on the Rutledge Handbook of Feminist Economics, where the social provisioning approach developed by Marilyn Power really serves as an individual starting point for each of the 50 chapters. So if we take a closer look, what is the social provisioning approach about? We find that it consists of 5 main components. So the first one is that both paid and unpaid work are fundamental for what economics is. So not only paid work in the paid sector, but also unpaid work, which can be unpaid care work, but it can also be subsistence work or activism. They are also counted as work. The second point of the social provisioning approach is that human well-being is a central measure of economic success. Human agency is seen as important in the social provisioning approach and also as strongly related to questions of power. Ethical judgments are an invaluable part of economic analysis. And last but not least, the social provisioning approach outlines the importance of really intersectional analysis, stating that we have to acknowledge that there are different systems of oppression which intersect, for example, along the lines of class, race, and gender. So while we do see that points 2 to 4, the human well-being, which is central, like we talked about the human needs before, human agency and questions of power and ethical judgments, we do see those reflected very well in the provisioning systems approach. But we also see that points 1 and 5, or at least that's the argument or the case that Christina and I tried to make, are largely missing, and where newer debates on provisioning systems could really learn a lot from feminist economics debates on social provisioning. So this brings us to this broadened understanding of the economy, and when I have to try to explain what I mean by an ecofeminist approach to the economy in one image, I would always choose the iceberg as exemplified by, for example, Maria Mies, where she says that basically what we see or what we think about when we think about the economy is usually only the tip of the iceberg. It's what is counted in GDP. It's the focus of our economic analysis. It's what is counted, what is inside, what is rendered productive. And then on the underwater side, what we see is reproductive activities. We have the blank spots, we have that which is not counted or not even countable in GDP. And we have this boundary in between. So we have this strict boundary, which kind of divides productive from reproductive and what is counted in GDP from what is not counted. And so the hierarchy in this image is not by coincidence, as you might imagine, but it really shows that the tip of the iceberg is the focus, but it relies, like it couldn't be over the water surface if there wasn't, for example, carrying activities and ecological processes that sustain it, right? Like without without ecological, like for example, without access to natural resources, or without caring activities and social reproduction, where the workers themselves are reproduced, like not from 9 to 5, but from 5 p.m. to 9, basically. Without this, no production process at all would be possible. So the argument that Christina and I tried to make in our paper, and after this slide I'm also handing over to Christina, is that basically debates on provisioning systems really mostly focus on this tip of the iceberg, while debates on social provisioning in feminist economics often focus on the right side of the triangle, talking mostly about social provisioning, but not really necessarily including this dimension of biophysical inputs and of ecological reproduction, so to say. So in our conceptual framework, what we argue is that basically we need a combination of those two debates, where debates on provisioning systems can learn a lot from feminist economics to really arrive at this broader vision of what the economy is, through like a notion of social ecological provisioning. I would end here and look forward to discuss this with you later.
Thank you very much, Corinna. And I immediately hand over to you, Christina.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Corinna. As you said, I will continue what we're arguing on the, in our paper, and I will give you some examples of different food provisioning systems and shed light on them from an ecofeminist perspective, as Corinna now explained. So since Marilyn Power, who's also already mentioned, said that starting places matter, we decided to focus on those invisible places, so on the bottom of the iceberg, for the examples of the food provisioning systems. And we think that it's important also to focus on them because they have the potential to empower us for a social ecological transformation, also in a normative sense. And this goes along with the understanding of food sovereignty, which also aims for a democratic control of the food chain, so of the production, distribution, and consumption side of food. And then on the slide you see that we also highlight, as Corinna already mentioned, those two dimensions like intersectionality, and also like the focus on unpaid work, but unpaid work, that's important, I think, is always connected with underpaid and paid work. So the first empirical example I want to give, which is important in invisible food provisioning, is subsistence farming, and also to some extent peasant farming. And it's those farms who allow to nourish the majority of the people, like on the planet. And the example I really usually give, because I've been working on Ukraine and land grabbing on Ukraine also. For example, in that country, it's the really small scale producers who produced almost all the potatoes and vegetables, so products that are very much labor intensive. And it's those producers who are enabling or like providing a kind of food sovereignty, but they're not talked about. What we hear now is, think about Ukraine, it's the global food prices, it's the place Ukraine has in the global food regime, but this aspect is kind of not highlighted at all. And then we also know from much of the literature, for example, from the Global South, that women who are responsible for feeding also the family often, for example, don't have access to land and don't have access to official land rights, and this also like kind of disables them to provide food. So that's the first example. The second example of invisible food practices are food self-provisioning practices that come now move a bit further west from Central and Eastern Europe. And there, those food self-provisioning practices, so allotment gardens, for example, have often been considered in literature, in academic literature, as backwards, not as modern, because the East had to catch up with the West. And Petr Jelička, who is a Czech geographer and who has been for a long time working on that, he defined that term quiet sustainability because those are sustainability activities, like, for example, allotment gardens, and those activities are carried out by about 1/3, I think, of the Czech population. They're not framed as sustainable, and that's why they call them like quiet. Another example which focuses on care and comes from Lilian Pungas, who works in Estonia and Estonian Duchess. She also highlights that this dimension is important to take into account not only like relations between humans, but also between humans and non-humans, and that humans are taking care, like for non-humans, on those dachas. So the third example you see on the slide are what we call in our current project values-based modes of production and consumption, a bit of a terrible long-term maybe, but usually you encounter those practices more or less invisible but not paid, termed as alternative food networks. And those are, for example, urban gardening or community-supported agriculture. And they enable, when we think about CSA newcomers, to get engaged in agriculture. And they also rely on different like values, like solidarity. They rely on voluntary work, as we said. And yeah, there you can also like see this relation between non-paid work and then like paid work in the model, for example, of community-supported agriculture. And the last example I want to give are the harvest and food workers. Because when we think about agriculture, we often think about either large-scale farming or we think about family farming, but we leave out the picture that family farms also rely on women, on family, as it says, on harvest workers. And they have been a bit more talked about during the pandemic because we were missing them. And then there was a bit more also of discussion because of the war in Ukraine, because when we think about Austria, there is a lot of people coming from Eastern and Southern Eastern European countries who are coming as harvest workers. And they also, like, they're underpaid, then they're missed in their own home countries as farmers, and they also missed like for care work. And like to extend this not only to focus on farms, we also see that, for example, in supermarkets, which are the crucial distribution places for bigger cities at least.
Hello? Hello?
Could somebody mute you, please? Sorry. Thanks. So that also, like, it's not only on the fields, but also in the supermarkets where underpaid work is taking place. And yeah, we saw that also like in the pandemic, where we were clapping for people, but not giving them better wages. Okay, so those were 4 examples of invisible food provisioning systems. And now on the second and last slide, I want to give 2 examples of strategies which could strengthen them, because as Corinna said, our goal of the article is A, to make them visible, and B, to kind of think about the relationship then also between those provisioning systems under and above the iceberg. So how can these invisible places be strengthened from an ecofeminist strategy? And the one strategy is like one that you probably all know from Frigga Haug, who suggests that we need a different time regime, so we should dedicate 4 hours to wage labor, 4 to K-work, 4 to political activities, and 4 to leisure time, not including 8 hours of sleep here, but a different distribution of time to enable other activities than wage labor. And the second proposal that actually comes from Corinna and her colleague, they are thinking about fair wages, so minimum wages and maximum wages in combination with a guaranteed individual income and basic services that are provided as a strategy to foster, an eco-feminist social ecological transformation. And if you have any other strategies, I would be happy to hear your suggestion then in the debate we can have after that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christina. And now the floor is yours, Julie, for the third presentation.
Okay, hopefully you can all see that and hear me okay. So thank you very much again for the invitation, Andreas, and thank you very much to Corinna and Christina for their presentation, because what I'm going to say is, in a sense, fits really really nicely into some of these broader discussions about social provisioning around food, because food is obviously a really important provisioning system that has economic, social and ecological dimensions. And what I want to do is kind of look at this in a slightly different way, in a less conceptual way, but look at it in relation to a particular place. So I'm going to be thinking about challenges of the food system. How do we understand the challenges, and how do we start to think about different kinds of actions that might be relevant for this food provisioning system? And I'm going to talk specifically about Wales, because this is something I've worked on, both on food systems but on other areas of policy in Wales. So I think it's interesting also to see the connection between food and other. My presentation will be thinking about the renewal of the food system in Wales, some of the challenges and some of the some of the ways of thinking about policy, even if I don't have the answers. So let me move on. So what I'm going to do is to start by exploring some of the characteristics of the food system in Wales, and this really touches on the notion of a provisioning system that we heard about just now from Corinna. So it combines the biophysical with the social and the economic and the financial, and it's about how the need for food is met through different kinds of resources. So it's a specific illustration of that system, but clearly those systems will have very different characteristics depending upon which country, which region, which place we're looking at. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the food system in Wales and some of the challenges that arise from that, and then we can think a bit about some of the policy possibilities and opportunities. So I guess the place to start is thinking about the land, which is the ultimate biophysical resource. And I've got a little map in the corner, which is an old-fashioned relief map, and you can see that there's a lot of upland in Wales, and almost 80% of Wales is classified as a less favoured area, which means it's got poor soils, steep slopes, difficult climate. So it's the kind of land that is difficult to cultivate. So most of Wales is not suitable for a broad range of food production. And as a consequence, the main agricultural products are dairy products and red meat. So that's 90% of the agricultural output is in those categories. So Wales has just over 3 million people, and it has just over 1 million cattle and 10 million sheep. So you can see it's really, it's a really livestock dominated food system, or agricultural aspect of the system. And from an ecological point of view, this raises immediate issues because animals, account for a large amount of carbon and indeed methane emissions. So if we're thinking about the climate emergency, then livestock production systems are a big issue here. If we want to widen our ecological concerns to the nature emergency, then the kind of livestock farming that you find in Wales has really reduced biodiversity. So it's very dominated by monocultural pasture land, very few trees, overgrazing in some places. It doesn't, although it looks very green, it looks very attractive as a landscape, it's actually quite deficient in terms of biodiversity. And then if you think about, moving to the more human side of things, this is a farming system that supports mainly small farms, mainly upland farms, the kinds of farms that only are viable because of financial support, and even then it produces very low farm incomes. So it's not this is not prosperous farming. This is low income farming. If you then think about, again, moving on to sort of think about how food is kind of consumed and domestically provisioned, well, of course, the 3 million people in Wales can't eat all this meat and dairy products that are produced, so 95% of it is exported. There's very little domestic processing of the agricultural products, and despite the efforts of the government in Wales, there's limited growth of a sort of an SME processing sector. So another aspect of the food provisioning system is the dominance of large supermarket chains. So again, if we shift to kind of that social provisioning aspect and what happens within a household in terms of the production and the consumption of food, this is mainly being provided through large supermarket chains, usually accessed by car and often by households on low income. So the supermarkets play a very important social and economic role in providing affordable food, a diversity of food, and meeting the needs of people working long hours. If you compare supermarkets with independent retail, the food is typically cheaper, you get much more diversity, longer opening hours, and so on. Another important social dimension of this system in Wales is relatively poor public health. So healthy life expectancy, relatively low compared with other parts of the UK. So from a social perspective, the quality of food, the consumption is an important issue. Now, obviously, this is an area where there has been a lot of different kinds of policies over the years, but a major emphasis of policy has been on public procurement. So trying to use public procurement of food by public services as a way of trying to shape the food system, which can deliver a certain amount, but the problem is that the value of public procurement is simply dwarfed by the scale of private consumption. So, for example, the public spend on food in Wales about 90 million euros compared with private spend of €3 billion, mostly in supermarkets. So you can think about just one large supermarket is equivalent to the whole of the public procurement. So focusing only on the way that the state can use its expenditure to shape the system is going to leave out most of the expenditure and most of these kind of economic and social relationships that we see. So there are multiple connected challenges, and I think these connect very much to the kind of ecological and social issues around food production, distribution and consumption, and that clearly raises the question about how can they be addressed within this very particular national context. So Wales is part of the UK, but it has a number. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened to my screen here. Try again.
It is, yes, now it's
okay,
here.
right, I'll try again. I hope I don't lose everything again. Okay, so I was trying to think about what the policy responses are, and you know, Wales has a number of devolved powers, and it has powers over farming. One of the things it's doing now is developing post-Brexit farming support. It also has responsibility for food, for natural resources, and for forestry. So in a way, the relevant authority, Welsh Government, is able to control a lot of the areas that are relevant to a food provisioning system. But that doesn't mean, of course, that progressive change is necessarily going to follow. And I think one of the reasons for a lack of progressive change is the difficulty of having challenging conversations around the food system because of all the different interests, social, economic, political, that we find there. Another interesting aspect in Wales is it has this legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations, which at one level is a very profound and radical piece of legislation, which should mean that policy and the use of public spending should be, those allocations should be made with reference to the, you know, as the Act suggests, to the well-being of future generations. So it should take into account ecological and social considerations, and it should encourage this long-term view. However, the problem is that it's an all-embracing piece of legislation which doesn't directly address the inevitable trade-offs that we have if we want to address social and ecological issues. So it combines you know, sustainability with prosperity and a whole series of other things. So it could in principle help meet needs in planetary limits, but that potential hasn't yet been realised. One of the problems, of course, is the dominance of supermarkets. So many of the things that happen outside of any engagement with the dominant distribution and retail system, which of course is both a UK national system, but much larger with international supermarket chains, is quite important. And of course, the other thing that may seem obvious to most of us, if we think about food provisioning systems, they interconnect very clearly with other systems like health, education, and also other economic and social systems like tourism. So although we can see that food connects to everything else, the way that policy is organised is very much in silos with separate budgets, separate responsibilities, separate policy instruments. So this is another structural challenge. So how do we think about aligning some of the social and ecological challenges with the structure of government and policy that exists? Well, we can think about this through a number of different examples. We think about perhaps the biggest and in some ways the most difficult one, which is restructuring the land use and food production. Then the government has produced multiple strategy documents in the last few years, but they tend to be focused on one aspect of the problem. So focused, for example, on farm support or supporting food processing or planting more trees. But the real elephant in the room is the dependence of the Welsh food economy on livestock. So there's no public commitments to reducing the number of cattle and sheep. even though this is, you know, essential for ecological reasons, but also probably pragmatic as well, because food habits are changing across Europe. And after Brexit, you know, the traditional export of beef and sheep meat is much more difficult than it was. So there are practical reasons as well as ecological reasons for tackling the big issue about how to make a shift away from this dependence on livestock farming. But whilst we see fragments of relevant policy, there's no big conversation going on in policy circles, nor do we see the kinds of democratic organisation like citizens' assemblies that you might need in order to kind of discuss these issues in a creative way. Second issue, which is relevant, I think, and this relates to some of the things that Christina was saying just now, is that there's a lot of interest everywhere, of course, in various notions around local food, community food, healthy food, and so on. But also lots of confusion about, you know, scale, potential contribution. So we saw in the pandemic there was a lot of expansion of mutual aid schemes and alternative distribution schemes. But in Wales, these are fairly small. They're mainly, the alternative distribution is mainly addressing middle class niches. It doesn't connect with some of the social needs around access to healthy food. And indeed, despite the dominance of supermarkets in retailing and distribution, we also have this phenomena of food deserts in Wales. So areas where there's high density of low-income households without access to affordable and good quality food. So in a sense, the supermarkets tend to co-locate in towns and suburbs where there are medium level incomes and high car ownership, leaving these food deserts elsewhere. So a lot of the alternative schemes so far haven't addressed some of those issues. So we need to think about, how do we do more complicated things? How do we have some of those complicated conversations? And of course, if we think about what a renewed food system that met social and ecological needs more effectively, what that might look like, of course, it's not one simple thing, and it's not one single set of options which is going to get us there. But I think it's best thought about as a complex process with many actors, lots of actions, and a lot of learning that's required around how to, you know, reframe conversations and how to kind of consider some of the choices that exist. So here's a few ideas on my final slide. One of the things I think that's worth doing is trying to distinguish between, you know, the front office politics and the importance of providing a vision, a plan that recognises the direction of travel, but that also recognises different interests, different stakeholders. So it has to be something that seems to be attractive, but it has to recognise the interests of stakeholders, and it has to gain trust. And then, of course, there needs to be a back office which is capable of working in a coherent way, working across the different silos, acknowledging the difficulties, acknowledging the trade-offs, and finding ways of developing policy and finding out how things work. Because I think the challenge of renewing complex systems like food is it's not all necessarily clear that we already know how to do things. Like, how do you reduce the size of the livestock in Wales whilst still sustaining rural communities where upland farming has a social and a cultural value beyond simply the production of agricultural products. So we need to kind of have ways of approaching both that kind of, you know, the public narrative, but also the back office policy and politics. And I think there is some useful starting points in Wales, because clearly the various problems of the food system are things that are addressed in different ways, to a limited degree at least. And I think some of these provide a starting point to trying to address some of the more complex problems with more joined up actions. So a couple of examples that we could look at. One is the extension of free meals in school, which the Welsh Government is now going to do for all children at primary school age, so that's up to the age of 11. And that's been a long-standing ambition, and that's being introduced now over the next couple of years. And that clearly is more a public health policy than a food policy, but it shows the connection between the sort of the economic and the social very clearly. But there are also a whole series of logistics challenges around procuring food and organising kitchens, which create all kinds of opportunities. It creates opportunities to develop new supply arrangements with producers and processors, but possibly different collaborations with a range of new actors, particularly thinking about the scope for community kitchens, which could have uses outside of the school day to address some of these other social needs. And then a second example would be thinking more proactively about how to encourage more horticulture and more cropping on the land that's more suitable for those uses through a variety of infrastructure support, including having difficult conversations with the supermarkets, because given the scale of the supermarkets versus public procurement, it's not possible to deliver much change at scale without trying to incorporate the supermarkets into the expansion of production and processing of a more diverse range of food products. And then a third example is thinking about alternative kinds of systems and their connection with land use, and the most obvious one is the development of the wood economy. Wales is a country with a lot of green space, but as you can see from this photograph here, not many trees. So addressing economic and social and ecological needs is something that the wood economy can potentially do. Of course, it's very tricky because you need to avoid the creation of new kinds of monocultures, and it needs the development of activities that will use the products. But there are possibilities here, and these are areas where conversations are starting. So I'll stop there. Apologies for the interruption. My presentation is focused very much on one specific food system because I think it's helpful to think about the details. But I think some of the challenges connect with the things that Corinna and Christina were raising. And I think hopefully it raises some interesting areas for us to discuss.
Thank you very much, Julie. And yeah, also apologies from our side for this interruption. Christina and Corinna are now also on, and we agreed that it's up to you to give a first response or kind of enter in discussion. Whoever wants to start from the two of you. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I can start. Maybe I have one or two more questions, Julie. Thanks for your presentations. I see many points where I do agree, and where I think they're more there may be characteristics of the specific food system you were presenting, but when you think about supermarkets, so large retail chains, those are one of the main characteristics of the so-called corporate food regime we live in. So this applies to lots of local or national and food systems. I think the dependence on livestock and or meat, at least in diet, maybe not in production, but in diet also, is one thing that is characteristics of our global food regime. And also the third thing that I noted down, which I haven't talked about, but that the alternatives I have been mentioning are often connected to middle class people because they have the access to them, they have more time maybe, or more just capital to invest. So there I see commonalities, and which are just part of this broader corporate food regime we live in. I was wondering, because you were first describing the farming sector, and since we in our presentation say that intersectionality is a strong point, and I tried to highlight in my examples the role of gender and ethnicity, at least to some extent, what we found. So I was wondering who is working, who are the farm workers, or do you have a bit more information on that? Or and talking about public procurement, which I also see as a very crucial point. I was wondering if organic production also plays a role in that, because from other work I did on the city of Vienna, like here we have a certain percentage of organic produce that should be consumed, and also like in kindergartens and so on, for example, and we would see this also as an entry point for a more ecological food system. So what's the role of organic production, and maybe also does this change? Because in Austria we also see that this is changing now with the multiple crises we face, that organic production is like not our main problem, but it's that we have to produce enough food. So we know there is. Yeah, so those would be kind of my comments or like common points, and like 2 questions that I would have, but I'll pass on to Corinna.
I don't know if you want to answer first and then I ask my question, Julie, because it was already a quite extensive question. So as you prefer, like I don't mind.
No, I mean I'll try and answer some of it before I forget. But thanks, Christina. I thought that there were really nice connections between our presentations, and I immediately thought that I was guilty of missing the you know, your points 1 and 5 to some extent in my presentation. So it's a really important, I think, to think about those things, because work, you know, the work is clearly very important, both in its formal and informal sense around food, and a lot of the paid work is not well rewarded work as well. And I think in terms of who are the farm workers, I think mostly family farms in Wales, because of the nature of the land. It's not there's some bigger farms on the periphery, but mostly relatively small family-based farming, and has all of the issues around people, you know, the family farm typically doesn't support the family. So you have, you know, most members of the family will be working on the farm and also off of the farm. So it's a generalization, but you have patterns of work where you have members of the family typically have at least one job off the farm at the same time as working on the farm, and often running other kinds of enterprises around, you know, tourism and things of that kind. So it's a complex work arrangement. And I think that there are interesting questions there, and I think there's also interesting age characteristics, that typically farmers are, you know, are relatively old compared with the rest of the working population. I think that's both a problem to rural sustainability, but also an opportunity perhaps to try to think about how do you renew the food system in ways that will support younger people on farms to do things. So I think some of those issues around you know, intersectionality are really interesting. So I wasn't able to look at those in detail. In relation to organic production, I think you're right that the current problems around cost, both to households and to state organisations, is kind of squeezing some of that possibility for more progressive procurement around organic food, because of inflation of food. I think is meaning that there's less priority on procuring organic food versus procuring any food. So I think that that's probably less of a priority, but absolutely, I think that the state is able to play a role in supporting progressive production, whether it's, you know, more based on plants, whether it's based on organic, or at least kind of less intensive systems, is something that's very important. But I think the as you said, the supermarkets are really important actors and often completely ignored in a lot of the policy. I mean, obviously supermarkets figure very highly in kind of academic analysis, but in terms of the policy, supermarkets are often not clearly in the focus. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Corinna, it's up to you. Just for the three of you, there has been a question also in the chat raised to the three of you. That and another one. But Corinna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Julie, for your presentation. I thought it was very interesting to really dive into this topic of food provisioning systems for a more concrete case study, also for one which I'm not so familiar with. And I was wondering what concrete, like you also mentioned some starting points for transformation, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more concretely on possibilities for transformation towards more socially just, because you mentioned this poor public health, like you mentioned some things of social justice. So what possibilities for transformation towards more socially just and ecologically sound food provisioning systems do you see, like in the current political environment in Wales? Like what kind of actors do you see, or where are like how do power relations maybe of, I don't know, like the meat, the cattle industry, like how powerful is it in lobbying? So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on possibilities for transformation.
Okay, thank you. I think the current situation has made the social aspects of the crisis worse. In terms of access to affordable food is clearly more of a problem. And that's leading to, I think, some new actors stepping in. So you see, the problems about access to food leading to, for example, providers of housing looking at how they can support their tenants. So social housing organisations looking at how they can kind of provide food, tackling the issue of food. I don't know whether you have a similar phrase, this idea of food deserts. In low-income areas where people don't have access to, affordable supermarkets. In a sense, you have too many supermarkets in some places and not enough in others. So I think there are some interesting approaches looking at how do you give, lower-income households more access to good food, not simply any food. And some of that, I think, is going to happen through schools and through employers. So you see some more enlightened employers looking, for example, at the role of food in the way they, organise their work. But I think that what you see at the moment is not a coherent policy, but fragments of initiative by housing providers, social enterprises, and others who are responding to crisis. I think in the pandemic, the crisis was about, people who were isolated, how do they access food, and that could be kind of organised. Whereas now we have a problem about people who simply don't have enough income to be able to afford to buy good food, and that requires, I think, more coordinated responses. So I think we haven't seen a coherent set of policies, but you're seeing on action on the ground to do things. I think it would be interesting in the next year to see whether some of the things that people are learning to do might have a longer term role in policy, because food is so fundamental to health and education and everything else that I think, the current crisis is threatening in Wales to make a lot of social inequalities much, much worse. So it's both an opportunity to do things, but it's also a very dangerous point, I think, for going backwards on that. So I think there are interesting things, but there's not a coherent policy response yet.
I mean, but that was already an answer to some of the questions in the chat. I assume, Christina, you have read the questions, and you might have some answers?
Yeah, I could start with examples of thinking about how to expand alternative food networks, or like to make them accessible to a broader audience, on people with lower incomes and not like middle or higher income. So I think one interesting thing is that I was shortly mentioning, for the case of the Czech Republic, but also other Visegrad states like Poland, that there is actually quite, it's about 1/3 of the population who is still involved in gardening, which does not like mean that they fully provide or do fully self-provisioning, but there you can already see that this question of access to land with lower income directly, CSA, for example, in Austria, or like community-supported agriculture, did it in that way, or tries also to do it in that way, that you don't pay for your share, but that you can also work. But there again, then it gets tricky because of legislation and what happens if, I don't know, there is an accident, for example, and so there's some kind of technical issues that can be a bit hard connected to that, but people are thinking about an alternative to like the money exchange, and how to include people giving their time, let's say, in that kind of sense. Then another initiative people in Vienna might have heard about is Mila, the democratic supermarkets. So Julie has been talking a lot about the strong power of supermarkets, like of the big retail chains, and the democratic supermarket aims to include diverse variety of people now here in Vienna, and they want to work as a cooperative, which means that you again should then at least I think it was work 3 hours a month to be able to then also like buy things in the supermarket, and you commonly decide what is being offered like in the supermarket. But this is an attempt to make also good and not only but also organic food available, for example, in a bigger city as Vienna, where you need other chains than in small scale settings. Then I'm not completely sure if I understand the question of Amber in a correct way, but what we also found out in our research on community supported agriculture is that it is one difficult aspect for people how to get engaged in that is like the aspect of time, that they don't have enough time, they don't have access to land, they don't have enough time as a consumer, like an eater, and as a producer. And this is something that would have to be considered, and that's also, we say, 4-in-1 perspective of Riga Haug or others, like to open up that that box. And the other thing is that, for example, when we think now, that's not concerning now Great Britain anymore, but the European Union politics, like the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, then you can see that what they've been strategizing as the food farm to fork strategy, so opening up the boxes a bit, like, and also including the consumption perspective, is not really worked into policies we have today. So there is a big lack, and it's not supported. As I would say, it's only on paper as a strategy paper, but it does not. It's not reflected in the policies so far. And I'll pass on to Corinna.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christina. Maybe just to add on what you've just said about the question of Colleen, whether this can be kind of made to benefit also low-income people. I think it's something that, like, we do see, for example, if we look at community-supported agriculture in Austria, that many people who engage are middle class from academic backgrounds and stuff. But I think it's very important not to neglect that rather than being like just an asset for privileged people, like that forms of collective food provisioning have been and also continue to be really modes of organizing livelihoods in marginalized communities and or in situations of concrete crisis. So when we, because like if we put it this way, like how can it spread over to also benefit low income people? It sometimes sounds a bit like it's something that is kind of invented by people who have the time to do it. But I think it's very important to see that, for example, community kitchens often emerged like after situations of crisis. So I think like this mode of collective provisioning generally, not just in the food system, is something that we see often, that it is actually a mode of organizing livelihood for low income people and for not so privileged people who endure intersectional inequalities. Yeah. I think Christina already named some examples for that, so I think I would hand over to Julie because she also has some questions here in the chat.
Yeah, I think just to follow on from that point, Corinna, I think that the community kitchen is a really interesting kind of institution because it connects much more with different food cultures as well, and in the sense it provides a space for people to kind of to use, you know, different relations to food. Because we know that, you know, people who engage in food related activities get a lot of benefits, not simply nourishment, but a lot of health and social benefits from, you know, involvement in growing and participating in community food. So I think the expansion of community kitchens is a really interesting way of trying to broaden alternative arrangements away from middle class niches, particularly in urban areas where physically it's difficult for people to access food production facilities. I mean, there obviously are good examples of city farms and growing arrangements, and many of those linked with schools and attempts to sort of connect that to kind of educational objectives as well. But I think that it's still small scale, and I think trying to address those issues of inclusion through various means of, you know, preparing food, eating food together, as well as kind of growing food, is probably really important. There was one question in the chat about the future, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to be strengthened. I think that has to happen, because otherwise it just becomes a very nice sort of envelope that makes people feel very comfortable with saying everything is considered for the benefit of future generations, but it often avoids those very hard choices, for example, around dietary change. You know, no politicians don't like to tell people you must eat less meat, but you know, so I think we're in a difficult position that individuals, you know, have to retain free choice, and the politicians don't like to kind of prioritize one thing rather than the other. There's an attempt to sort of say, well, if we do enough good things, we can satisfy all of our interests, rather than saying maybe there are some hard trade-offs here, and we need to think about how those can be dealt with, which is why I think things like citizens' assemblies might be quite interesting in relation to some of those changes. I mean, we've had citizens' assemblies around climate change in lots of places, but I think some of those democratic discussions around things like diet changes, land use changes might be quite interesting, because they can address some of those trade-offs, and that might allow different new kinds of approaches to kind of emerge with a little bit more participation. So I don't know, maybe other people here have had experience with some of those kinds of institutions, but I think where we've got hard choices, then I think we need different ways of thinking about the problems.
Yes, let me use the opportunity to ask Christina, taking up the Wales case, which is very clearly a kind of oriented towards changing public policies, incentivizing civic initiatives. In how far the cases that you mentioned or others that you are researching, there are examples of this type of civil society public policy intervention cooperations, and what do you see as a potential for civic public cooperations in changing food systems?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll give the first example, also drawing on this last comment or like question in the chat about the practices. So I'll go east or west actually to the Czech Republic in our current project, where what me and my colleague are going to look at are on the one hand those, as I said, traditional gardening activities, but then on the other hand the new hipsterish urban gardening activities, and how to preserve them or how to amplify them would be like trying to bring them together or to communicate those different communities, and also how to, and that is where your question comes in, Andreas. Those initiatives are supported or not supported, for example, now by the city government in Prague and Brno, in our case. And here the hypothesis so far is that the traditional practices are not supported, but they're rather more or less being like gentrified, whereas like the new alternative food networks receive support. So this is the hypothesis so far, which is not strengthening those from city perspective, but maybe through coalition building from different activist groups, or like civil society groups, this could be strengthened. That's also what Lilian Pungas is doing for Estonia, for example, and for the Duchess. And so this is connected to those post-socialist traditions. And another thing also on the city level is, I mean, Julie has mentioned it, like public procurement. Vienna has a big role in providing food, and also like having this quota of organic food, for example. And in one of our projects, together with social-ecologists and biodiversity people, the idea was also to think not only about like organic food, but also what impact our food consumption has for biodiversity elsewhere, because this is not really mirrored in any of the produce so far, or it's not being labeled. Not saying that labeling is the only solution, but there is like lack of information what it does to biodiversity. So definitely public procurement is something where I would say, depending on the city, you have a cooperation between the city and civil society, also from actors from the food sovereignty movement. And then depending on each city, this could be more of a top-down or bottom-up kind of connection of that. So that when it comes to cities, and then when I think about rural areas, there is examples which not I, but colleagues have been mentioning and working on in Mals, for example, in southern Italy, where they try to create an alternative economic systems where food, as Julie said, like it's not a silo, but it's connected to others, like economic sectors. And they try to, well, not to introduce too much of the apple food industry, and try to fight also like pesticides, where they have been like quite successful so far. But again, on that regional area, you could see that the community, or like the municipality as such, played an important role in that, combined with people from civil society. So that's apparently the way how to go on a smaller scale. I think the big question is what to do. Julie also mentioned it several times with supermarkets and large retail chains, and also like on a policy level, but also on a research level, if we think about research, because in our recent report on food and climate-friendly living that is going to be published soon here for Austria, we could again see that there is a super huge lack of data or research in supermarkets. We just don't know what they're doing, or we do to some extent, but so I think, yeah, a dialogue, yes, is needed, but also, yeah, and a certain integration in several ways. I don't know how to frame it otherwise.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left. I mean, I can already thank you for your very focused and productive dialogue, and I had very little task to steer anything. Yeah? So I will hand the word to you, Julie and Corinna, if you have anything kind of closing remarks, and just before you can think about this, to answer Amber's question, the papers will be published hopefully soon, but and then they will be available online, and as soon as they are published, which will take some months, we assume, because it's peer-reviewed and all this, we will inform you via the International Kalpulani Society. Yeah, yeah, just this information. So then, Julie, Corinna, for closing words.
Okay, I think just to echo what Christina said, I think the supermarkets are kind of huge kind of institutions, and we tend to kind of think about alternatives, and we sort of walk around them very carefully. And I think that is a scope. I mean, I think, you know, have previously thought about the idea of social licensing, you know, because supermarkets in a sense are local monopolies often. They have, you know, in a sense they are able to kind of claim large amount of our income through their, you know, local monopoly position, and try to think about the idea of social licensing as a way of trying to enforce a more, you know, more responsible relationship, whether it's with farmers, local community, sharing their, you know, opening up their car parks for other social uses. And I think there's quite a lot of scope for trying to build different relations with supermarkets, but it does require higher level politics, because supermarket chains are national or multinational, and communities can't really engage with a supermarket. You've got to have, you know, higher level political institutions using the power that they have. They seem very reluctant to upset supermarkets because they see them as institutions that deliver food to us 24 hours a day. But I think to achieve many of the social goals and the ecological goals, I think engagement with supermarkets and more research around that would be really interesting. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I also think that it's really important to really talk about the analysis of the problem, where, for example, in this case, the supermarkets are one very powerful actor, and how to reorganize this. I also think what we talked about alternatives is really interesting, and the question of how to allow for those alternatives to actually flourish, and also flourish out of niches. And I think there it all comes down to really kind of bottom linked or top linked interventions, and in the sense of providing, for example, cities providing temporal and also spatial infrastructures for this, right? So often, like as Christina has mentioned multiple times, like we need to free up time to actually engage in this, free up time away from wage labor. There needs to be public spaces where, for example, community kitchens can take place, where people can access them easily. So I think it's really also the thing of creating space and time for those changes to happen. And yeah, maybe as a final word on provisioning systems, what Christina and I hope to really do in this article is to show why it is worth also taking a look under the water surface and kind of revaluing what is under the water surface, also social and ecological provisioning processes without monetizing them, like without shifting them to the top. And I think it's very complex, but I think like intervention points can be found, and some of them we discussed today, and I would be happy to continue this discussion also with you, Julie, on the topic of food systems, really.
Thank you very much, Corinna, Christina, Julie, for this very, very interesting contributions, and also the dialogue referring to one another during 1.5 hours. Just to add one, there will be a Polanyi paper published in a few weeks, which will include some of the discussions of the webinars as well. So it will be a discussion paper that covers the whole 3 discussions of the 3 webinars. So part of the insights you will also get in this Polanyi paper, but this will also be distributed via our newsletter and the website. Yeah, I will close this event. Say thank you also to Julia Fanghauser. She has, as always, organized the backstage, and you will get information on further activities via our different means. Thank you for staying with us, and have a nice evening.